Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin Young, and I'm a member of the Environmental and Social Action Movement, which is the coalition of campus unions and student groups that organize this panel. The panel will address how UMass can help end carbon emissions and achieve climate justice. This event is taking place on the heels of nationwide protests, many of them led by Indigenous organizers, against Enbridge's Line 3 oil pipeline and other fossil fuel projects. This movement has targeted dirty energy, as well as the financial institutions like Bank of America that continue to fund it. This week's protests at the White House remind us that UMass's actions have impacts far beyond campus, and they remind us of the importance of UMass standing in solidarity with people elsewhere who are fighting for environmental sustainability and justice. As some of you know, UMass Amherst has a carbon mitigation plan that was released this past February. The plan acknowledges the campus's contributions to the climate crisis and proposes very detailed measures for achieving carbon neutrality on campus by 2032. If this plan is implemented on schedule, it will represent a tremendous step forward. At the same time, we believe we must expand the conversation about energy policy. Everyone who is affected by the climate emergency has a role to play in the climate movement. Scientists and policy consultants are, of course, indispensable, but so too are workers, students, community organizations, and Indigenous nations. The participation and mobilization of all of these groups is essential for implementing the carbon mitigation plan successfully and for expanding it or improving it when necessary, to ensure that the energy transition occurs as rapidly as possible and that the transition is fair and equitable. We have four amazing speakers with us tonight. Each of them is going to speak for about 10 minutes and is going to address a different facet of the climate emergency while sharing their thoughts on how UMass can be the most responsible community member possible. After the speakers are done, we'll take questions from the audience. We have an online question and answer form, or question form rather, which we'll drop in the chat in a second. So throughout the event, you can ask your questions by clicking on that link. And I'll just note here that this is a public event, so just be mindful that there may be press present. So if you want to ask your question anonymously, you can do so by going to that link. You don't need to include your name. Following the Q&A portion, we'll go into breakout rooms where we can share our own reflections on these questions and meet some of the other people who are in attendance tonight. Our first speaker tonight is Rachel Sayet, who is the Native American Community Development Fellow at the 5 colleges here in the Valley. Rachel will first lead us in a land acknowledgement and will then jump right into her presentation. So I will turn it over to Rachel.
Akwai, greetings. Natasawis Rachel Sayet. Natasawis Akidu Sue. Hello, greetings. My name is Rachel Sayet. My name is Akidu Sue, which means she who reads. I come to you from the Mohegan Nation, and I am the Native American Community Development Fellow here at the 5 colleges, as Kevin just mentioned. So I appreciate that and your introduction. So I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement and just talk for a few minutes about some modern issues, how they relate to this panel. I acknowledge all the tribes, past and present, of this land that we are on here. UMass Amherst rests on Nonotuck land. The town of Amherst is named after Lord Geoffrey Amherst, a British general who was a leader on dehumanization and genocide of Native peoples. He spread smallpox all over the Northeast. I acknowledge all of our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. I myself am a member of the Mohegan Nation, so I'm one of these local tribes here, and all of these other relations are my kinship ties. What I want to say briefly about land acknowledgement is to try to move beyond land acknowledgement. Some of you were able to come to the Native American Indigenous Studies Symposium, which I was helping with back in May. And there was a panel talking about land acknowledgement. And it's definitely important to acknowledge the Native peoples of this land. But when you think about, doing a land acknowledgement or putting one on your email, just make sure you're thinking about also how can you move beyond just taking that step of acknowledging the land and maybe, supporting local Indigenous people, whether it be through buying Native authored books or Indigenous designed clothing or jewelry, or just, helping with issues that you feel like are important, such as the one we're talking about today, the climate change and Indigenous peoples, climate change in UMass, all of these things, finding ways to support. And, if people have questions for me, they can reach out to me directly to ask about ways to kind of, work with Native peoples. It's not always the easiest thing coming from outside a community to, come in with a good intention and know how to engage, because Indigenous peoples throughout history have been, traumatized by people coming inside our communities and recording our stories and our traditions, videoing our ceremonies, all of these things that have caused a lot of problems and trauma. And so it takes a little bit of time to build those relationships. So that's part of my job here at the 5 colleges, is to try to help people understand that it may take a little bit of time, but it's going to be worth it in the long run to build those relationships so that there's a reciprocal relationship, a reciprocal benefit with both the Indigenous communities here and the colleges, and ways to work together that are mutually beneficial in order to heal this past that we're talking about here with Jeffrey Amherst and the legacy here in this town. It's not any easy thing. So in terms of Indigenous people and climate change, it's not my subject of expertise, but I'll talk briefly. I talk a lot about food sovereignty as part of my work. My link to my website just got added to the chat, so thank you, Shana, for that. And I teach about Indigenous foods as well as oral tradition. And the food is specifically related to climate change in many ways, as well as many things that happen on the ground in Indigenous life on the daily throughout this country. But specifically when talking about the foods, there was a poet visiting today here at the 5 colleges who was talking about she can no longer harvest her wild rice from Minnesota to the level that she used to because the water levels are not the same. And because the pipelines are being built and all these other things that are happening on Indigenous land. And so these are issues that, again, we can get involved in as much as we can or as little as we can. Sometimes it's just supporting an artist, to help them. For instance, there was some artists at Standing Rock that were still trying to pay off their jail bond money a couple years ago. And so I was buying a lot of jewelry from them, because that's what happened. They were there protesting, trying to fight for their water, and, they were still paying off that debt, right? So things like that, finding ways that to support, but also can help in this fight we have against climate change and all of the stuff that we're talking about here today. It's all interconnected. Since we are here on Indigenous land, just think about, what are the local communities that I mentioned today, and ways that maybe you can connect, or you need to reach out to me, that's fine, to connect. And we can talk about some of these issues more in depth. So to Butney, thank you so much for having me. I may have to run in a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for those thoughts. Next, we're going to go to Rusty Polsgrove. Rusty is the environmental justice organizer at the organization Arise for Social Justice, which is based right here in Springfield, Massachusetts. So I will turn it over to Rusty.
Hi, I'm Rusty. I use they, them pronouns. I'm also a UMass undergraduate. I study in the BDIC program. I study makerspace management. Got to give a big shout out to the all campus makerspace, which is on campus at UMass. That was where I first really got involved in environmental justice. That's where I used to work on campus. And that's also the group that introduced me to Tatiana and got me the job that I have at Arise, which is pretty cool. I started at Arise in August. They had, the last time they had an environmental justice organizer was like years ago. And so it was a vacant position that they had decided to fill. So Arise for Social Justice was founded 30 years ago by women on welfare. In the first decade, they really expanded their definition. First, they were a poor people's rights organization. Then they were organizing low-income people to fight oppression in all of its manifestations. Arise is located on School Street in Springfield, and since its founding 30 years ago, they really have expanded to include all facets of life for people in Springfield. My job specifically is to be the environmental justice organizer, and so I have a couple projects that I'm working on currently. The first one that's pretty topical, especially with Rachel Sayet bringing up pipelines. Eversource, formerly Columbia Gas, they are looking to put in another natural gas pipeline through Springfield and East Longmeadow. They're looking to put in a pipeline that is redundant and is like already covered by the pipelines that already exist. And they're putting the health and safety of all of the people of Springfield and in the areas they plan to build through. So I'm working with the Springfield Climate Justice Coalition, who I know Murray and Vern are somewhere in the audience. I want to say hey to them. So we're working on opposing that. Something that UMass could do that would really, really help us is that UMass is a huge client of Eversource. So if they were to take a stance against the construction that's, in process, pending, going to happen, that would be incredibly helpful. Right now, we're petitioning Bill Ackley to cease, progress on the pipeline. They haven't started building yet, but they're headed in that direction. The other projects that I work on, I work with the Mold Committee at Arise for Social Justice. Springfield has had a huge mold issue for the past several decades. Recently, the Roderick L. Ireland Courthouse, which is right downtown by the casino, they found black mold in it, and they found that it was all throughout the building. And so they've taken everybody out of the building, and nobody's allowed to go in it, and they're doing all of the court cases on Zoom. What's really interesting about this is this type of mold has been prevalent in most of the homes in Springfield for, the past decade or so. But there hasn't been any legislation to stop it, any legislation to protect tenants, any legislation to force landlords to deal with it. And it's known to cause things like COPD, asthma, allergies. And so for a very long time, Springfield was the asthma capital of the country. And so what I'm doing now with the Mold Committee, we worked with a class at UMass to try and develop mold detection techniques. But currently we are working on writing a new city ordinance that would require, some sort of cap on mold, and it would require landlords to, fix and remediate any mold in housing because it's poisoning people. And then the other initiatives I work on are community choice energy. We are trying to get clean sourced energy to everybody in Springfield, and we're hoping to have it created and the infrastructure created locally by Black and Brown businesses in Springfield. And we are also pushing to get a racial health equity impact assessment. And what that is it would be a study that anybody who's developing anything in Springfield, any sort of new building, they would have to go through it and explain exactly how their development would impact marginalized and unheard people in Springfield. And it really is a device for us to try and end the segregation that's happening in Springfield. If you look at the demographic maps of Springfield and the way things are laid out, you'll find a lot of food deserts and areas that are populated by Black and Brown people. You'll find a lot of just like holes in coverage for people who need necessities like healthcare and food. Yeah, so that's like really what I work on. I'm really blessed. I have 3 awesome UMass undergrad interns who are interning with me. And the big thing that UMass can do for us is help us spread the word. You know, we've got fundraisers coming up for our mold committee and a couple other things. And those are really what we're trying to focus on. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of money flowing into the nonprofit sector. And so now that COVID has kind of, you know, plateaued in a certain sense, there's less of that happening. And so we are really looking to, you know, continue the momentum that we had gotten financially. I'm going to open it up to questions. I know I have 2 more minutes left.
Actually, Rusty, I think that we are going to wait until the end for questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass the mic.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that, Rusty. And this is really an invitation for us to think about how those of us at UMass can help support these community-based struggles like the ones that Rusty is talking about with the connection to EverSource, for instance. It's an interesting idea. And a reminder again that we are connected. UMass is connected to surrounding communities in lots of ways that may or may not be visible to us. So next up, we have David Hughes, who is the Climate Justice Chair at the Faculty Union at Rutgers University. That's the American Association of University Professors, American Federation of Teachers, AFT. So David is going to be speaking to us about a very interesting initiative between the Rutgers campus and surrounding communities. And I'll just turn it over to him so we can hear from him and perhaps think about how those of us here in the Valley might apply some of the lessons from his experience.
All right, thanks a lot, Kevin. And I'm really happy to be here in Massachusetts, so to speak, my state where I was born. I'm going to talk about, sort of as background, about how our union made this turn towards climate justice. And then I'm going to talk about a climate strike we organized with student and community groups. Then talk about what Kevin mentioned, which is a community solar 3-city program we're advocating, and then talk about the next steps. So how did our union get involved in climate matters? It's not obvious. We are a social justice union, of course. We care a great deal about equity among our faculty and between our faculty and other groups generally in the United States and the world. But it was only in 2019 when we started to take climate on board. And we did this by forming a task force of our faculty who expressed an interest in working on that issue through the union. These were natural scientists, atmospheric scientists, physicists, and so on, who, you know, and as you probably know, the natural scientists don't come to the union automatically. Our density has always been greatest in departments like English and history. So it was gratifying that they wanted to come to the union. And they were frustrated. They said, look, we've been advocating for decarbonization and other reforms for 20 years, and we've gotten nowhere. Can our little piece of the labor union help us? You know, when we're paying all these dues and everything too. What can you do for us? So we formed this committee. And at about the same time, and this was again in the summer of 2019, student groups approached us. We already had very good relationships with all the lefty student activist groups because we had a bi-weekly meeting held in the basement of the union, which we call Rutgers 1. And there's a kind of pooling of expertise. We also have, for many years, provided paid internships to student activists to do their activism in our offices. This was before the pandemic. Obviously, now we have that activism, that internship is virtual. So we already had these relationships, and they came to us and they said, we want to organize this climate strike in the basement. like where we organize a lot of stuff, but we want you to really be part of it and put resources into it, put people into it. So we were very thrilled to do that. And that led to the union endorsing the Green New Deal, our local endorsing the Green New Deal. Let me just, sorry here, I'm looking at my face and I'm trying to figure out how to get my own face off this, and I can't seem to do that once I'm the the star. But anyway, I made myself smaller now. So we endorsed the Green New Deal nationally. We also proposed with student groups a kind of local Green New Deal. And that would be something that's already been mentioned. That would be our university going carbon neutral. So we passed that resolution. We pushed that up to national AFT to jump a little bit ahead. And national AFT then, with constant pressure from our local and many others, and many very powerful teacher unions in Boston and Chicago and LA, and the AFT endorsed the Green New Deal in the summer of 2020. That's jumping a little ahead. So locally, again, we passed this resolution. We held this climate strike with student and, by that point, lots of community groups in September of 2019. 700 people showed up, which is a pretty large crowd for New Brunswick. And that started a process. We had 4 demands at that point: fossil fuel divestment by the university, a climate action plan involving net zero emissions by 2030, and the establishment of an Office of Sustainability. A lot of things dragged on for a long time, and this horrible thing called COVID spread death upon the earth, and we lost some time, but now I'm in a position to tell you that we won 3 out of the 4 things. We won fossil fuel divestment in February of 2021, February of this year. We got the plan last month. That's 2 things. We got half a thing because the plan says net zero, but by 2040. And we got an Office of Sustainability, but that's also half a thing because we're not sure if that office is going to have any power. So there's still a lot to work on, and student groups are still very much engaged in this and getting re-engaged as we return to campus somewhat. But I want to tell you now about community solar, because that's an idea that emerged after the climate strike, as we kind of pussyfooted around with the administration while they gradually pulled together their own plan. It didn't take long to persuade the administration that they should put up a lot of solar panels in a lot of places on campus. The way they wanted to do that was going to be quick and dirty by hiring or contracting with a private firm through what's known as a power purchase agreement. And the way that works is this large firm like Sunrun is the biggest one in the US, owns the panels, leasing the roof space or parking canopy space from Rutgers, and then makes a lot of money and gives Rutgers some of that money through the lease arrangement. Often, in fact, the company like Sunrun doesn't actually have the money. We're talking about a $700 million investment in solar panels and infrastructure at Rutgers. So Sunrun would go out to private equity markets, and those people make a lot of money. And private capital is rushing into solar farms because it's the best bet in town. You almost can't lose. And you benefit from a 26% federal tax credit, which incidentally, unless we get this passed in the Build Back Better bill, but so far, universities, unions, community groups, nonprofits, and so on do not benefit from that incentive because they don't have tax obligations. I can talk more in question and answer about some very complicated tax changes that are maybe written into the legislation that would help us a lot. So we said, what's a different model? And we talked to a lot of groups. Eventually, we found one in your area, Co-op Power, and Lynn Benander, who runs that. And together with her and community groups, we came up with a community solar plan. And that involves, there are 2 options, and the legislation is pretty good in New Jersey for this. One option is where community groups own the panels cooperatively. Now remember, these panels will be on top of Rutgers, and Rutgers would be one of the owners as well, but co-equal with all the others. So in Camden and Newark, which is where our smaller campuses are, there are community groups already who want to do this. and have a couple hundred members in each case willing to jump onto this. But we, of course, we still need the permission of the administration. The great benefit of this model is that then you can establish a community-controlled resilience hub. You know, there's the impact side of climate change. You know, people on the left, we care a great deal about decarbonizing, but we can't forget the impact side as well. And the impacts are felt very harshly on our vulnerable, mostly Black and brown communities in Camden, New Brunswick, and Newark. That's where our campuses are. They are in the poorest towns in New Jersey and some of the poorest towns in the East Coast. And they suffered enormously when Hurricane Sandy came. The next one that hits us that directly will be tremendously damaging. What you need in a hurricane and in the aftermath of a hurricane, you need a place to keep medicine cool, insulin and so on. You need a place to charge your nebulizer or your oxygen tank feeder machine thing, right? Medical devices. A lot of people died in Puerto Rico because they couldn't keep their medicine cold and their medical devices running for the couple of months in the mountains that they went without electricity. So Rutgers can provide, underneath the panels, a resilience hub accessible to communities. That's what we want in each of the 3 towns as well. And then we want hiring. We want this program, this installation to be run as an apprenticeship program with a project labor agreement and so on, wherein these same residents of Newark, Camden, and New Brunswick are trained for jobs on the Rutgers campus in the solar industry and then jobs more widely. And if this is done right, an institution as large and as statewide as Rutgers can be an engine for a really socially just form of energy transition, urban-based, resilience-providing, and job-creating energy transition in New Jersey. Next steps. So we have to continue to organize, and Students for Environmental Awareness, which is our main partner in this, has made community solar their fall and I hope their spring campaign. There are some interesting bargaining issues. I mean, all of this will be part of our bargaining campaign, which is about to start because our contract ends in July, and we do bargain for the common good. Some of these issues may actually be really mandatory subjects. So parking is a mandatory subject in our contract. Our administration has always set up parking as an all or nothing thing. So you pay $300 or something for an annual parking pass, and then people tend to use it every day. There's no option to pay, you know, even $10 per day that you want to park. So we want to change the parking to provide incentives for faculty and staff to commute less by car to work. For staff unions, I mean, telecommuting is a huge thing. We could cut carbon emissions quite a bit around here by going to a 3-day work week for people now on a 5-day week. The pandemic, of course, has opened up people's imagination about that. Finally, housing. If you think about students, of course, most of the commuting is done by students. Why do they live so far from our campuses? Well, you know, it's expensive around our campuses. Rutgers is the premier landlord in the neighborhoods of our campuses. Their dorm rates have gone higher and higher. We did a study of this a few years ago with a community group called New Labor. Generally, what you find is the ceiling for a dorm room becomes the floor for an apartment in one of the neighborhoods run by somebody you might call a slumlord. So as Rutgers raises its rents, so do all the surrounding private landlords. And we would like to have Rutgers act more in a public housing way of building dormitories for students which are affordable and therefore keep them living within walking distance or biking distance or at least bus distance of campus. Finally, to get back, I'm running out of time here, but to get back to the national stuff, we're represented, our local is represented on the Climate Justice Task Force of AFT, because I'm on that task force and I report to our committee and our leadership and so on. And we have been advancing actually with a plan to put solar panels and clean energy retrofits, along with, of course, the asbestos remediation and things like that, improvement of HVAC in schools all across the country. And we're hoping to get a lot of federal money for that from the Build Back Better bill. The other thing that you may see, and this is where I would love to work with some of you NEA members out there, if we could get higher education to divest from fossil fuels, that would be amazing. There's a lot of support for this within powerful AFT locals. This has never happened before in terms of a profession-wide divestment. But I think it's time, and if AFT and NEA could join with that and basically say the teaching and academic professions are done with fossil fuels, because we know about this stuff, we teach about this stuff, it's in our wheelhouse, and more importantly, we steward the next generation, and we cannot let our pensions and our money go towards robbing their future. So that's it. I'll be happy to take questions whenever the schedule allows that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in what you just told us, and it's hopefully food for thought for thinking about how we here in Western Massachusetts, and particularly those of us at UMass, can think creatively in solving some of these urgent questions. And the example of Rutgers is a really inspiring instance where labor unions, in collaboration with community organizations, have shown that they can play vital roles in ending carbon emissions and also advancing the cause of justice and equity. Precisely what this event is about, carbon mitigation and carbon mitigation in the most equitable, the fairest way possible, that doesn't leave anyone behind. So thank you for that. We are going to move on now to Eve Weinbaum, who is the co-president of our Faculty Librarian Union here at UMass Amherst, the Massachusetts Society of Professors. And Eve is going to be talking about our unions, the campus unions proposals related to carbon emissions and climate justice. And I will turn it over to Eve.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. It's great to be here with everyone. David and I first organized together about 30 years ago, not to date ourselves, but it's cool to see that we're sort of still on the same page doing this work. And it's an honor, of course, to be on the panel with Rusty and Rachel as well. I am going to share my screen because I have a lot of information that I wanted to share with you about what the unions have been working on. Oops, you can see my screen now? Okay. So I want to talk about why climate justice is a union issue, how we got involved. I think in some ways the story is similar to the one that David just shared about Rutgers. In some ways we've been ahead of the curve. UMass divested from fossil fuels in 2016, I believe. We were the first major public university to divest, and that was thanks to an incredible group of student activists who had sit-ins and took over buildings and really made that happen. And so we're sort of working on the next wave of activism right now. The UMass Union Coalition is made up of USA, which is classified staff, PSU professional staff, AFSCME, and MSP. And we put together several coalition proposals this year. Sort of for the first time, we took on an ambitious set of issues that we wanted to work on together. So that's been really exciting. The other proposals included joint salary proposals, proposal around expanding childcare, which is another dire need in the Valley, and proposals about holidays and work time, in addition to this, originally we called it the Green New Deal, and now we're calling it climate justice or environmental sustainability, choose your term. And I'll go over the proposals in a minute. It came from many union members who were working on these issues. Some of our members are active in the Carbon Mitigation Task Force. and the Chancellor's Sustainability Advisory Committee. I know some of the leaders of those groups are here tonight, and it's great to be able to work together. We had a climate justice committee and many subcommittees that a lot of you all worked on, and a shout out to Madeline and Kevin and Bird and Christine and Sigrid and a lot of people who really made this happen. And now, as Kevin mentioned in the beginning, it's the UMass Amherst Environmental and Social Action Movement. So unions have lots of things we can do to influence these the university around all of these issues. We can educate members about environmental and climate justice issues. We can organize and mobilize for change. We can build alliances with students and with community organizations, and we can negotiate contracts that include climate change issues. So I'll mostly talk about that. That's a legal right that unions have, and it's one of our sources of power. So just wanted to be clear that we're working on all of those things at once, and bargaining is only a piece of our work. The Carbon Mitigation Task Force was organized by the Chancellor, and in his charge to that committee, he said, be revolutionary. If you're not from UMass, you might not know that this is one of the university's slogans. And it was a really ambitious charge that he set out, with the goal of being 100% on renewable energy, so net zero carbon emissions by 2030. The largest sources of emissions on campus are buildings, electricity, and transportation. And so that task force has been working for a while. Their central recommendations are replacing steam heat with low temperature hot water, transitioning to renewable energy, revising building standards, so that includes renovations as well as new construction, increasing energy efficiency, and they have collected an unbelievable amount of data and research to show what needs to happen. The price tag is high. It's about $500 million to implement their whole plan. But over time, it would result in a lot of savings for the campus. So the question is how to come up with that initial investment. And we have some ideas. So that will be an ongoing project. The Carbon Mitigation Task Force did a series of webinars last fall, about a year ago. And one of the things that they concluded was that community support will be essential if any of this is going to happen. So that's part of why we're here, and that's where we see the unions playing an essential role, working with the wider community to really make sure that these things are put into place. So we have sort of divided our issues into two categories. One is subjects that are under labor law called mandatory subjects of bargaining, things that the administration has to talk to the unions about. And the second is bargaining for the common good, which David mentioned also, which are sort of broader subjects. So I'll just briefly talk about how our issues fit into those two categories. In terms of mandatory subjects of bargaining, we have the right in our contract and under labor law to safe and healthy working conditions. So anything that has to do with safety in our buildings has to be negotiated with the unions. So we have proposals on the table to repair sick buildings. That includes hazard abatement in places where there may be mold, inadequate ventilation. We've learned a lot about ventilation over the past year and a half. And we have many buildings on campus that need extensive work in that area. Retrofitting for energy efficiency and deferred maintenance. Anyone who works on this campus, I don't have to tell you what the needs are. Some of them are very small scale, like sealing leaks in buildings, which would pay for itself in within 5 years. And some of them are bigger, like upgrading the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems in many of our buildings. we have the right to negotiate around comfortable and productive working spaces for staff and faculty. So that's near the top of our list. Second is around campus closure days. And because buildings are such one of the main sources of carbon emissions, as well as commuting, we know that fewer days of people being on campus would be great for the environment. So we have a proposal to close campus the week of Thanksgiving and from Christmas Eve to New Year's Day. And then we have proposals around flexible and remote work schedules for the same reason. We want to bring fewer commuters to campus on a daily basis. And this aligns really nicely. We worked on these proposals before COVID, but it does really align with the union's proposals to enable flexible work as much as possible and to have a long-term goal of a 4-day work week for everybody. Parking is the last category of mandatory subjects of bargaining, and we have a whole bunch of proposals related to parking. We want to make it easier for people to buy occasional parking permits so that if you mostly take the bus or bike or walk to campus, you would have a low-cost way of parking in a convenient lot on the occasions that you need to be on campus. We want to give priority to carpools and make sure that there are more spots available to carpoolers with lower fees for parking. And we want more charging stations for electric cars. I just heard from someone who said, you know, I'm trying to drive my electric car as much as possible and the charging stations are always full. So there's a need for more of those, as well as bike parking that is, you know, covered and protected. So those are all mandatory subjects of bargaining. We have presented these issues at the bargaining table with the administration, and we're going to be following up, and we may need to do some organizing and bring people to bargaining and talk about how to make some of this happen going forward. In terms of the bigger issues that we're working on, these would fall under what we call bargaining for the common good, reducing carbon emissions. We share that goal with the Carbon Mitigation Task Force, as I mentioned, but I think there's a lot of concern about whether there will be enough urgency to make this happen by 2030. So that's where we're at. We want to make sure that any of the work that's created are good union jobs. So whether it's doing the deep energy retrofitting, deferred maintenance on campus, there's work surveying and evaluating our current spaces, administering programs, supporting climate justice curriculum, which we would like to expand the existing programs. And we want to make sure that all of this work is done with an eye toward promoting gender equity and racial justice in terms of doing the hiring and making sure that the work is equitable. We have social justice goals, including cutting ties with the Bank of America and other large polluters. Eversource was a new one that we just learned about, but we can think about how to include that issue as well. We've talked a lot about minimizing waste on campus, and we have some good ideas about how to do that, and food justice also fits in that category. The unions have spent a lot of time advocating and lobbying for state funding to support this agenda. The American Rescue Plan Act, which provided stimulus money to the states, it provided a lot of money to the state of Massachusetts. There's about $5.8 billion that the legislature needs to decide how to allocate. And the MTA has put forward proposals. That's the Mass Teachers Association. That's the parent union of most of our campus unions. Excuse me. And many of us have been talking with legislators and doing that lobbying. We're still waiting to see the administration's plan. We haven't seen the document where they lay out the need. Other campuses, the community colleges and state universities have made requests of that pool of funds, and we're hoping to work with the administration to make sure that some of that money comes to UMass Amherst. The federal stimulus funds are really a perfect fit for what we're talking about tonight, because they're intended to support one-time costs. And we have so much work that could be done on campus to improve our buildings and our infrastructure. It would be a great use of one-time money and a real investment in the future. So we're working on that and would love to involve more people in that work. And then finally, joining labor and community coalitions and trying to build solidarity and power for future campaigns. So tonight is a good step in that direction. In terms of the long-term issues, sometimes we get the question, why are the unions working on this environmental justice stuff? And so these are some of the answers that our people have responded with. Obviously, climate change kills people every year, more and more every year, and working class communities and people of color are impacted the most. It's clear that the economic costs of climate change are growing, and the question is who will pay, who will benefit, and who will lose out. And it's incredibly important for unions and working class organizations to be involved in those discussions. We've seen what austerity looks like. Every time there's a crisis, the state and the university respond by tightening things up, whether it's furloughs and layoffs, cutting programs, cutting budgets. And the only way to change that is for us to be organized and make sure our demands are on the table. And finally, unions are the people who are going to do the work to make all of this change happen. So we should be at the forefront of deciding how our campus is organized, how decisions are made, and how the work gets done. So I'll end where I ended last time, which is to say change is coming for sure, no question about that. And we all need to be part of the process from the very beginning. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Eve. So we are going to go to questions now. And we were thinking we would take a round of questions. We have a number of them trickling in the online form. So rather than do them one by one, we'll take a round, and then we'll give time to each of the speakers to respond. Unfortunately, Rachel Sayet did need to leave early, but she did drop her email in the chat if people want to follow up with her. But the other three panelists are still here. So the first question, which Sigrid has just posted in the chat: what can we do collectively to formally request one-time ARPA funds for deep energy retrofitting the older buildings on campus? And I'm guessing that is directed at Eve Weinbaum.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that, and there may be other people who have thoughts about this as well. There was a hearing at the state legislature about ARPA funds for education, and as I mentioned, the MTA spoke, and we had a proposal that prioritizes this Green New Deal climate change sustainability work on campus. I think it would be great to think about whether we could organize meetings with some of our local legislative delegation and just to focus on this issue, because I think there, as we know, higher ed tends to get shortchanged in this state, public higher ed, and I think it's not at the top of their agenda. So this would be a great thing for the unions to work on, and to be able to involve students and community members would be fantastic, working with our local legislative delegation as well as any legislators in students' home districts, because those are people we have a harder time connecting with.
Great, thank you, Eve. So there are a few more questions in the chat here. And I think I'll read three in a row. So the first one: can you please say more about community choice energy? For the whole group in the room, how might UMass tie this local source? How might UMass connect to this type of project, I guess? Secondly, someone says, I pay Eversource when my rent is due every month. Does this relate in any way with the pipeline they are trying to build? So how is the pipeline being funded? Is it being funded by rent payers? A question for Rusty. And then a question from a student. As a UMass student, do you have suggestions or desires for how faculty can integrate more climate change learning opportunities into their courses? So those are three good questions, and let's go to each of our speakers. Rusty, would you like to take the first stab at it?
Yeah, absolutely. So community choice energy. Community choice energy is essentially this principle that, you know, within your own community, within your own locality, you can produce the energy that you need to run the homes and businesses that are, you know, in your community. So in Springfield, what we're trying to do right now is there's a lot of money coming from the federal and state governments to switch to clean energy. So Springfield is trying to create Black and Brown owned businesses that are ready to create clean energy infrastructure like solar farms, put solar panels on top of roofs, put up the wind turbines and things like that. And so in terms of what people in Amherst can do, people in the UMass community, vote in your local elections and get in contact with your local representatives and your state representatives and say, hey, I don't want Eversource to supply our electricity anymore. What are you doing for us to get a different supply of electricity that keeps money local to our community? Or what are you doing to get energy that is better for the environment? So in Springfield, that's kind of what it's looking like for us. And then the other question was about the pipeline and how that's being paid for. That's a great question. I am not entirely sure, but what I will say is they have been like routinely leveraging prices up to people in Springfield, and they will send people door to, oh my goodness, I'm getting notes. Ratepayers are going to cover the cost. Thank you, Murray, who's texting me. Ratepayers are going to cover the cost for that. In Springfield, they send people door to door to ask people to like lock in what their current rate is because it might go up. And so they're locking people into really awful premiums, and it's been a big problem for our community. And then for UMass, for them to incorporate climate justice into their learning, I want to say somebody who's definitely doing it right is Steve Fernandez. I took his service learning class in the engineering department. And what's really great is he connected us with, you know, local organizations and organizations across Western Massachusetts that needed help, you know, specifically with things like research. That's how I got connected with Arise, is I was working with Tatiana through the mold committee on a project. And that was what, you know, started our connection. And we were able to make very big steps in a lot of the missions that we were working on. So I would just ask that, like, you know, if you're a UMass teacher, you got smart kids who know how to read, who know how to use the internet really well, put them to work, you know, doing some of the academic legwork that goes with, you know, researching and brainstorming and getting ready for a big project or initiative. Like, that's huge. Yeah, I'm going to pass it on to whoever's next.
Am I next here?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, David.
Sure. So the only question I think I'm qualified to answer as an out-of-stater is the one that Rusty just addressed about how faculty can or should teach more and teach differently about climate change. And I agree entirely with Rusty and with what Steve seems to be doing. You know, involving students in practical kind of learning laboratory situations with activist groups or for that matter, with private sector solar installers. Anything that gets students out of the classroom and being part of the energy transition, especially the socially just side of the energy transition, is fantastic. And so a lot of the people on the Climate Justice Committee that I mentioned, the union's Climate Justice Committee, are very keen on changing the curriculum so that students actually get involved in the advocacy and the various kinds of data that we need for community solar. So all that is very good. I will say I have one caveat to this, because often that's where the discussion ends. You know, as faculty, we fall into the, what is it called? The knowledge deficit model. And we sort of believe if we just gave everybody more knowledge, then they would be more active and supportive on this issue or that issue. The way things have panned out at Rutgers is actually our undergrads know everything they need to know by the time they get here about climate change. You know, they've just lived through Hurricane Ida. They're scared, right? They're scared about their future. They don't need an atmospheric chemistry class in that. So one thing I think for faculty is that we need to be a little humble and recognize that it may be the student activists who have the expertise and the energy. And when they appeal to us to do stuff, which they certainly have to the union, then we should listen and step out of the teacher role a little bit. So having said that, the teacher role is tremendously important, and I support the spirit of the question, but it's got to go further and wider than that.
Great, thank you so much, David. So I do want to pause for just a second and encourage people, if you haven't done so, if you want to submit a question, you can do so at the link that is in the chat box. We also have another link to be added to our mailing list, and this link also includes a brief survey about tonight's event. So please don't leave without filling that out. So we're going to continue going through our speakers. We're going to pass it over to Eve now.
Thanks. I agree with everything David just said, and just wanted to point out that one of the MSP, the Joint Union Coalition proposals, is actually to for the administration to fund curriculum development around climate justice. So our point was that, you know, there are pockets on campus where that's happening, and it's great, and it's very community engaged and activist. And there are other places where it's not happening, and we think this should be integrated into, you know, everything: social sciences, public health and health sciences, education, you know, natural sciences, engineering. So we do have a proposal on the table to support that kind of curriculum development and training and increase. There's a great program that's in place now that is sort of a learning lab, and our proposal is to expand it. I also just wanted to put in a plug for anyone who's asking, you know, how can we do more of this? All of the unions are going to need support around our bargaining issues. The administration's response so far has been pretty clear that we're not going to get what we want just by sitting at the table and making good arguments. So one thing we're going to be doing soon is bringing people into negotiations to talk about these issues and why they matter. That it would be great to include students as well as faculty and staff and librarians. So if you're interested in doing any of that, you can always get in touch with me, with msp@umass.edu, or with any of the unions, and let us know that you'd be willing to participate in something like that.
Thank you, Eve. We also have one more person in the room, at least, who can perhaps speak to the question of the American Rescue Plan funds and how we as labor unions, as student groups, as community organizations might work collectively to make sure some of those funds are used for carbon mitigation and climate justice. And that is Max Page, who is in the audience. Max is the vice president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, which has been one of the unions that has taken the climate crisis seriously. So I'm going to invite Max to say a few words, and I'm going to try to make sure that we get him unmuted so that he's not just speaking into the wilderness. All right, I have asked you to unmute. I think that you're unmuted now.
Thanks, Kevin. I do feel like I spend most of the time speaking into the wilderness. So it's great to be here. And obviously, along with being vice president of the MTA, more importantly, I'm a professor of architecture and history at UMass Amherst. So just very briefly, this debate, I just want to talk about ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. And there is a roiling debate right now, and by right now, I mean within the next 4 or 5 weeks, about spending a good portion of the over $5 billion that the state has sitting in a bank account ready to spend on a wide range of things that are vaguely related to recovery from the pandemic. So there's a lot of us pushing hard on that. I think I've sent to Kevin and Eve the link to the massteacher.org website where we've laid down our proposals, and one of them being investment in healthy, green, and safe public college buildings, and as well as school buildings. So just so you know, what the good news is that the community colleges and the state universities have already publicly shared their desire to invest heavily in building repairs, ideally in more energy efficient ways. So it's totally in line with what you all are doing here at UMass Amherst. Of course, those of you who are in the administration or on this, it would be really nice to also learn what UMass is submitting, because we have not learned that. We have not seen that yet, but we hope that it is in line with spending a fair amount of money doing definitely needed, shovel-ready, environmentally friendly building repair projects right now. So the MTA is making that an absolute priority for the next 4 weeks. We're going to have a series of social media ads specifically on this ready to go next week, which I'll share widely and hope you all will share widely. And I just wanted to encourage everyone in their various political districts to do what Eve said, which is it would be great to arrange those meetings with state reps. Joe Comerford, the senator from around here, has been absolutely essential to this and is supportive, although hearing from you that this is truly something she needs to prioritize is always good. But a lot of other reps, it's great for them to hear that this is a top priority right now. Before Thanksgiving, they are going to spend, I don't know, $1 billion, $2 billion of this ARPA money. We want to make sure a good chunk of it goes to public higher education, climate-friendly building repairs. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Max. So we do have a few more minutes for this Q&A portion. We're going to do one more round of questions from the audience, and then we'll turn it over to the speakers for brief responses before going into the breakouts. So the next question is, are any of the union climate action initiatives connecting as stakeholders with community engaged research projects? The second question, how can UMass Amherst's power as a consumer be harnessed? The dining services seem to favor buying from local sustainable producers. What about other purchases, including energy? Don't we get our natural gas from Eversource? And then the third question, what are the immediate actions that we can take or action items we can work on individually and locally that you think would have the most impact and do the most for short-term and long-term goals? And that, of course, is a question for the speakers. It's also a question for all of you once we go into the breakouts. And then a final question or two. So many talented and engaged community folks we can learn from at UMass. Should we set up a fund to compensate them when they come to campus? And then the final question, how long was Rutgers' climate strike? Question for David. So why don't we go in the same order? We'll start with Rusty.
Okay, awesome. I'm going to start with the question about UMass's power as a consumer. So UMass's power as a consumer is honestly incredibly underutilized in like almost every way. I know that the dining halls, they're I'm a UMass undergraduate student. I'm gonna say that again. I'm a UMass undergraduate. I've had a couple different jobs on campus. My biggest takeaway from that is that UMass is continuously looking for the easiest and simplest way to get something done. And a lot of the times that's through our byways system, because that is where we keep the library of all the stores that have us registered as a nonprofit, and therefore we don't have to pay tax at them. We also have contracts with specific people about, where we buy our paper, because we have a contract with WB Mason and stuff like that. I think that something that the UMass community can definitely take a stand on and hopefully get some action on is, having us more carefully choose where we're buying, anything and everything. Because, Home Depot is where we get all of the stuff for the maker spaces, not by choice, but it's because, Home Depot is in the byways system. So I think that that's something that we could really, hold a magnifying glass to and make some progress on. And then, yes, so we do get our natural gas from Eversource. That is a really big thing that, we could start working on now. That would be very helpful and, in parallel to what's happening in Springfield. And then, in terms of other on the ground stuff that people at UMass can do, I am honestly a little bit disconnected. I'm in Springfield most days, so I'm interested to hear the answer. And then the last thing I would say is definitely compensate people from the community who come to campus to do any sort of any sort of justice work in general. The biggest thing that stops Springfield residents from getting involved in climate justice that impacts their everyday life is the fact that they are trying to feed their families and make rent and pay for inhalers and all of that stuff. And the one program that I work with, which is the Public Health Initiative, that's really doing things right from my perspective. They compensate their resident advocates on a quarterly basis and they write them checks. And that is huge. And that is why we have, so much energy and momentum for those initiatives. All right, I'm done.
Thank you, Rusty. David.
Yeah, thanks. So the question about the climate strike, it was not a strike. In fact, there was a lot of debate about that term. This is a term that comes from, I think climate strike was dreamed up by Greta Thunberg and in Stockholm. And initially we said, well, we're not gonna call it a strike, because that devalues our main weapon, our strongest weapon in terms of a labor action is a strike. And we don't want our members confused between a demonstration and a strike. But the students were very insistent about this phrase, and so we called it a strike. It was a demonstration, it was an afternoon, but it was part of a national day of student-led climate strikes. I don't know what we could imagine a strike that involved climate-related demands. That would be down the road, not too far down the road, possibly. One thing I want to mention, because somebody asked about immediate action items, and so I'm not on your campus, but one thing that might be practical. So for resilience hubs, you're not in a good location because you're not really around particularly vulnerable people. People particularly vulnerable in the case of an electric outage. But I gather you have a large bus system, and probably the administration is already planning on making those buses electrical, which means that basically they're batteries on wheels. And so you can imagine a situation where there's a big hurricane and campus closes, people who can go home are sent home, there are no classes for a week or so, the bus system is reduced to a skeleton or not running at all. And then you want to take those batteries and put them someplace where people can use the electricity, especially if you're generating more electricity every day through solar panels on campus. So you can drive those buses out to Springfield or wherever there is need and make an arrangement with a community organization that has a fridge, run an extension cord from that battery to the offices of that organization so that people can be keeping their medicines and food and so on cold, charging cell phones, charging medical devices, all that. And it seems that that should be the responsibility of the university, because it has assets, it has the ability to provide, to both to generate the electricity and then to distribute it in this socially just and necessary way. I'm done.
Thank you, David and Eve.
I think that's a great proposal, and it fits well with what the unions have been talking about. We have the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority, PVTA, runs our local buses, and we've been trying for a while to get UMass to invest more in the public transportation system, and this just gives us a new angle to make that case. You know, I think what I really want to do is go to the breakout rooms and hear from people what they want to focus on, because, you know, we in negotiations, we've talked so much about these issues, and the administration has said, you know, you just keep giving us long lists of proposals and there's no way we can do all of these things. So, you know, as I said, we're not going to win by just making good arguments. We have all the research on our side. We have great arguments. We have really smart people in the room making the arguments. And now what we need is people who are willing to do stuff. And so the first step is to find out what your priorities are, what people care about the most out of all of the issues we've discussed. And then we can put you to work. We can figure out how to take on some actions, whether it's working with legislators and trying to get more money freed up for some of these activities, or working on campus and trying to change the university's practices.
Great, thank you, Eve. So that concludes the Q&A portion. I'm sure there are more questions that we didn't get to. I know it looked like there were about 24 questions total. So I'm sorry if we didn't get to address yours. But we did want to spend some time going into breakout rooms so that you can all reflect on the event, and especially think about how we can apply some of the lessons and insights from what the speakers have told us. So we have some community guidelines that we've drawn up slash stolen from other groups who do this kind of thing. And we wanted to just put those out there, encouraging people to, first of all, keep your mics muted when not speaking to reduce noise interference. Secondly, respect and recognize others' feelings, backgrounds, and cultural differences. Keep in mind that we each come into the room with different sets of knowledge, different experiences, and we all have something to learn from those around us. We all have something to teach to those around us. Thirdly, be conscious of how much you're speaking. So if you find yourself speaking a lot, take a step back so others can participate. If you are not speaking, then maybe step up and say something. And as far as note taking goes, we did want to be able to keep a record of what we talk about. So, you know, even if it's just a few bullet points of what your group talks about, it would be really valuable to have some written record of this. So Steve just posted in the chat this shared note taking document. And for sake of simplicity, we're asking that the person whose first name comes first alphabetically be the note taker, assuming you have access to a computer. If you don't, then it can pass on to the next person. But I know that when you get into a room with 10 strangers, it can be awkward, and you know, it wastes time just, you know, waiting for someone to step up and volunteer. And it's certain types of people who tend to get saddled with that work more often than not. So we thought that we would just make it totally random, make that responsibility random. So we're going to divide you into breakout groups. It looks like there'll probably be about 8 people or so. Many of the groups will have a designated facilitator. I think all of them will, in fact. So you won't have to worry about that. And we're going to stay in these breakouts for about 12 minutes. And then we're going to come back for a very brief closing, and we'll be done around 6:30. So bear with us. It'll take about a minute for us to divide into these breakout rooms.